Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning from wherever you may be coming, or tuning into or from. My name is Eddie Portnoy. I am the academic advisor at the Max Weinreich Center at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Today we have a fellowship lecture in Eastern European Jewish literature. This lecture has generously been funded by the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Fellowship, as well as the Vivian Levsky-Hort Memorial Fellowship. And I believe we have some of the Hort family with us. So thank you for joining, and also thank you for your generosity. Our fellow lecturing today is Matthew Johnson. Matthew is a PhD candidate in Germanic Studies at the University of Chicago. His dissertation concerns the relationship between Yiddish and German language literature in the 20th century. His research has been supported by the YIVO Institute, the Fulbright Program, and the IFK in Vienna, as well as the Posen Society of Fellows and the Yiddish Book Center. His lecture today is entitled Glikl's Afterlives on the Circulation and Reception of Glückel of Hameln's Memoirs. And once again, as Alex said, please put your questions in the Q&A function. Thanks so much. Enjoy the lecture. And if you do like what you see and hear, please consider making a donation to the YIVO. We always appreciate your help. Thanks so much. Take it away, Matthew.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen quickly. So hopefully that worked. Okay, thank you so much. First of all, to the staff of the YIVO Institute, in particular to Eddie Portnoy and Alex Weiser, and to the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz family, and to the Vivian Levsky family. I'm really grateful for all the support. I'm also very happy that this talk happens to correspond with new entries about Glickl in the Shared History Project of the Leo Baeck Institute, which I encourage everyone to take a look at if you haven't already. And I'm also very grateful to a number of archivists and librarians who have helped me to find materials or who have otherwise digitized books and manuscripts, making research possible during a pandemic. So I'll begin. In this talk, I investigate the belated circulation and reception of Glickl's memoirs, written in Western Yiddish in the 19th and 20th centuries. Meaning I'm focusing on the reception in the 19th and 20th centuries. Glickl was born in Hamburg in 1645 and died in 1724. At the age of 14, she married her first husband, Chaim Hamel, and remains widely known today as the author of 7 little books, as she termed it, which she began to write due to a surfeit of worries, trouble, and heartache after her first husband's death, in which she continued to write with some interruptions over the subsequent decades. In these 7 books, which together constitute her memoirs, though this genre designation, as I will later discuss, is not unproblematic, Glickl recounts key events in her life and family history, the birth of her 12 children, her involvement in her husband's and later in her own business affairs, and her difficult second marriage, as well as various political and religious events, including the spread of the plague and the rise of Sabbatianism. In her 7 books, Glickl further adapts and tells stories and fables. She reflects on and works to assuage suffering and melancholy, and she delineates her spiritual and ethical commitments. In this light, the scholar Chava Toniansky suggests that Glickl's memoirs express nothing less than a philosophy of life to be handed down in manuscript form to her children, to whom she repeatedly addresses her writings. In this talk, I present the early stages of a research project that focuses less on Glickl herself than on how her work has circulated and on how it has been received in the centuries after her death in 1724. A number of editions and translations of her work across multiple languages transformed Glikl into an icon of Ashkenazic cultural history, and she remains one of the best-known Yiddish writers in Europe, North America, and Israel. Her memoirs have been widely read in translation and assigned in countless schools and universities, and Glikl has been the subject of museum exhibitions, as well as of artistic and theatrical adaptations, including the production pictured here, starring the prominent actress and director Ida Kamenska. In 2006, Chava Twoniansky published a new edition of the Yiddish text of Glikl's memoirs, based upon the extant manuscripts, as well as a new translation into Hebrew. Sarah Friedman's English translation of this edition followed in 2019, a translation that I will quote throughout this talk. In justified praise of these editing and translation achievements, the scholar Ada Rappaport Albert described Twoniansky and Friedman's work as magisterial and noted that, quote, Glikl's memoirs are by now world famous as a literary gem and a precious historical document, but they have so far been accessible only in heavily edited, abridged recensions and translations into various languages, end quote. In the larger research project that this talk is part of, I take Rappaport Albert's characterization as a point of departure and ask, how did Glikl's memoirs become world famous? And how did earlier editions and translations, despite their apparent shortcomings, shape how her work has been read and understood? As a means to answer these questions, if only in a preliminary fashion, I track the specific ways in which Glikl's memoirs circulated in the late 19th and 20th centuries and analyze the textual iterations and material forms, namely pages in various periodicals, privately printed volumes, and relatively cheap best-selling books that constitute this history of circulation. I thus consider how heavily edited, abridged recensions and translations made Glikl's memoirs accessible to a broad readership for the first time, as well as transformed their author into an iconic, oft-cited, and contradictory figure of modernity. For over a century, seemingly in line with the author's intentions, Glikl's memoirs did not circulate beyond her own descendants. Her original handwritten manuscript was lost, but later copies survived, including a copy made by her youngest son, Moshe. In 1864, however, Glikl's work began to circulate more widely when the folklorist Abraham Tenlau published excerpts from it in a feuilleton in the Orthodox newspaper Der Israelit. These excerpts were followed in 1896 by David Kaufmann's critical edition of the Yiddish text, and later by translations into German, Hebrew, English, and modern Yiddish, among other languages. This history of circulation reveals the porous boundaries between scholarship and popular forms of textual transmission, and especially in its early stages, entailed a complex negotiation of the relationship between Yiddish and German, as can be seen, for instance, in this fragmentary manuscript of a copy of the memoirs held in the National Library of Israel, in which German language marginalia on the right-hand side can be seen. The initial editors and translators of Glikl's work after Tenlau included David Kaufmann, Bertha Pappenheim, and Alfred Feilchenfeld, pictured here. These editors and translators approached their task from different geographical and cultural locations, and with various religious and political commitments, and they held often contradictory views about the aims and methods of textual editing and translation. These early editions and translations were followed by translations into other languages, completed by the likes of Marvin Lowenthal, Alexander Rabinovitz, Josef Bernfeld, and Beth Zion Abrahams. The early editors and translators, especially those pictured here, were remarkably successful in establishing Glikl's memoirs as a newfound classic. While the basic contours of this history of circulation are well known to scholars and are often repeated, though with frequent distortions, the specific editions and translations that set Glikl's work into motion have only rarely been analyzed in detail and even then, usually in ways that focus only on their divergence from the purported original. Most recent scholars of Glikl have attempted to situate and understand her writing in its own context. They have endeavored, that is, to strip away the heavily edited, abridged recensions and translations, and to gain a less obstructed view of the author as she lived in the 17th and 18th centuries. This is necessary and ongoing work, and it has shaped the new edition by Toniansky and translation by Sarah Friedman. But the recent appearance of these complete and historically rigorous publications also provide us with an opportunity to reconsider the editions and translations that came before, which, despite or even because of their errors and anachronisms, offer insight into how Glikl's work came to matter in complex and contradictory ways in the modern world, at a time of rapid cultural change and in the midst of fraught debates about gender, secularization, and Jewish identity. These editions and translations offer insight, that is, into the belated circulation and evaluation of Glikl's work, which only came to have a widespread cultural impact in the 20th century, long after the author's death. In the remainder of this talk, I will first provide a bit more information about the initial editors and translators of Glikl's memoirs, and then highlight a few of the ways in which they came to evaluate her work in terms of genre, gender, and language. Abraham Tenlau was, to my knowledge, the first to publish any part of Glikl's writing, which he presented in fragmentary form across a series of feuilletons in the Orthodox newspaper Der Israelit. Little is known about Tenlau's life, but by 1864, when he began to publish excerpts of Glikl's memoirs, he had already established himself as a leading figure in the growing field of Jewish folkloristics, or Volkskunde, which, as the historian Aya Ayada writes, dedicated itself to the systematic investigation of Jewish cultural and spiritual traditions, everyday life, and popular culture and belief. In line with his later work on Glikl, Tenlau compiled and published widely circulated collections of Jewish legends, folk tales, and sayings, in which he adapted and presented Yiddish language sources, both written and oral, for a German reading audience. More as an aside, since this talk is part of a series of Max Weinreich Fellowship lectures, and that while access to archives has been limited due to the pandemic, I was lucky enough to have spent a few days at YIVO before the first lockdown more than a year ago. And I was surprised to find that many of Tenlau's manuscripts included in the papers of Max Weinreich, which I think demonstrates the importance of 19th century folkloristics and related projects in genealogy and family research, of which Glikl's writings are often subsumed. That is, it demonstrates the importance of these older research projects for later efforts in Yiddish literary and cultural history and linguistics, as undertaken by the likes of Weinreich. And it reveals a largely forgotten influence of Tenlau, who has only recently been the subject of new scholarship, like that of Aya Ayada's. Okay. Tenlau's excerpts were followed by the editorial work of David Kaufmann, the scholar David Kaufmann, who was born in what is now the Czech Republic in 1852. Kaufmann taught for much of his life in a rabbinical school in Budapest before his premature death in 1899. It is Kaufmann's edition, pictured here, published in Frankfurt am Main in 1896, that set the stage for the widespread circulation of Glikl's work, and that established the paratextual framework in which it would later be understood, including the title and genre designation of the work and the idiosyncratic Germanizing formulation of the author's name. The book includes a critical edition of the surviving manuscript in Western Yiddish, footnotes, an extensive German language introduction, a Hebrew language title page, and various genealogical tables and appendices. While Kaufmann's edition did not circulate widely among a general readership, it found its way into numerous libraries and specialist collections, and was widely read by scholars of Jewish studies and by a handful of important Yiddish writers and critics. It further served as the basis for the first translations of the work and was, until Chava Twoniansky's recent publication, the only published edition of the Western Yiddish text. Bertha Pappenheim published the first book-length translation of the memoirs and based her translation on Kaufmann's edition. Born in Vienna in 1859, Pappenheim was raised in a bourgeois and Orthodox Jewish family. After her death, she was, rather infamously, identified as the young, so-called hysteric patient, Anne O., the subject of Josef Breuer's landmark case study and one of the founding patients of what eventually became known as psychoanalysis. In the decades after her thwarted treatment, however, Pappenheim became increasingly involved in social work and activism. She organized various girls' homes and educational institutions, advocated for the rights of women and girls and refugees, reported on poverty, sexual abuse, and human trafficking in Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, and in 1904 co-founded the League of Jewish Women. Pappenheim enacted throughout her life and career orthodox approaches to communal life, so that her feminist activism was coupled with an enduring, albeit critical, commitment to religious tradition, which precipitated her interest in Glickl and in Old Yiddish literature more generally, which was often addressed to women readers. Here you can see a famous painting of Pappenheim dressed as Glickl, which reflects her felt closeness with the writer. And this visualized identification of the early modern writer and modern translator, their blurring of identities in a way is, I would suggest, paradigmatic of the belated circulation and reception of Glickl's work, which has primarily been read in translation, a perhaps obvious fact, but one with very complex and still understudied implications. Published in Vienna in 1910, Pappenheim's translation was issued as a private printing. However, while most scholars suggest that it was printed exclusively for Pappenheim's own family, there are reasons to suspect that it was not intended solely for members of her family and circulated more widely than is often acknowledged. The most striking evidence for this can be found in the pages of a Frankfurt Jewish newspaper, which in 1909 published an excerpt from Glickl's memoirs in Pappenheim's rendition about the controversial figure Shabtai Tzvi. In Frankfurt, moreover, Pappenheim later lectured about Glickl's memoirs, presumably using her own translation, upon the invitation of Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber. And the particular book pictured here, held at the Leo Baeck Institute, contains a dedication to Henrietta May, one of the co-founders of the League of Jewish Women. The influence of Pappenheim's translation can also be borne out by the fact that it was consulted and cited in sometimes critical ways by many later translators, including Alfred Feilchenfeld and Marvin Lowenthal, whose translations into German and English were the most widely read by a general readership in the 20th century. Indeed, though it has been subject to quite a bit of criticism by recent scholars, Alfred Feilchenfeld's translation was the publication most responsible for Glickl's growing fame in and beyond the German-speaking world. The son of a prominent rabbi, Feilchenfeld was born in Dusseldorf in 1860. After his studies, he worked as a teacher in various capacities and was eventually named the director of a Jewish school in Fürth, Germany. He published several studies, including a history of the Jewish community in Hamburg, which first sparked his interest in Glickl's work. And his later translation, pictured here, of Glickl's memoirs, which he called Denkwürdigkeiten, was published as a relatively cheap book by the Jüdische Verlag in Berlin in 1913. The publication became a bestseller and later went through multiple reprintings, including in 1920 and 1923. And unlike Kaufmann's edition or Pappenheim's translation, it really circulated among a relatively broad and general readership. This is the title page of the first edition, which includes like very interesting visual materials and illustrations, including illustrations by Menachem Birnbaum. There's a lot to say about these early editions and translations and about how they were received. In my larger research project, I plan to engage in a more detailed analysis of them and of the particular books and material objects that can be found in numerous libraries and collections today, including at the Center for Jewish History. In the penultimate part of this talk, however, I will merely highlight a couple issues, namely genre and gender, that are at the center of how Glickl's initial editors and translators evaluated her work, and that point to how their editorial and translational choices shaped how her writing came to be understood and assessed by modern readers. Another really important issue that I'm very interested in, but will skip because of time, is language. But I would be happy to talk about that more in the discussion. This largely has to do with Kaufmann's decision not to translate or to transcribe the Yiddish text, the language of which he figured very interestingly as the ripeness of fruit and the color of the butterfly's wings, as well as Bertha Pappenheim's approach to translation, which stayed very close to the language of the Kaufmann edition and combined forms of translation and transcription, which I'd be very happy to talk about later if there's interest, but we'll leave for now. So to return to the issue of genre, in manuscript form, Glickl's work does not bear a title or genre designation. In his inaugural publication, however, Abraham Tenlau described her work as a diary or Tagebuch, initiating an editorial tradition that has insistently underscored the autobiographical or memoiristic aspects of her writing. As the scholar Chava Twoniansky writes, in the 19th and 20th centuries, translators and scholars applied genre designations such as memoir to a work that was composed at least 180 years in the past. Considering Glickl's work in light of contemporary literary conventions, they situated it within the genre categories of their own time. Glickl referred to her writing, as Twoniansky later notes, with various pronouns and deictic markers, or with very general terms like haksav, the writing. Glickl does not offer a specific term that accounts for her work as a whole, which at least from a modern perspective may be considered as an example of a cross-genre or hybrid genre, as her work includes passages that resemble didactic literature and Tuchinas, as well as passages that could, for example, be categorized as a travel report, hagiographic tale, anecdote, historical chronicle, or lamentation, all interwoven with citations from and allusions to various Jewish and non-Jewish sources. In the 19th and 20th centuries, however, Glickl's work was most often understood as a narrative account of her life and family history, which enhanced the perception of it as both an historical resource, a first-person account of a particular time and place, that offer a unique lens onto Jewish life at the turn of the 18th century, and in particular onto various economic and social practices. Still today, it remains a key source in the study of the early modern period. In this regard, in the introduction to his edition, David Kaufmann underscored the historical value of the memoirs and delineated what he described as their cultural and moral historical content, and their relevance as well to Jewish family history, their importance further buttressed by the relative paucity of Jewish autobiographical writing in general. Gender also played an important role in the understanding of her work as memoir. While Kaufmann, for example, adopted a critical and philological method, he frequently, and at the same time, adopted a presentist perspective that coincided with and sometimes contradicted his philological approach. In the 1890s in particular, Kaufmann had become increasingly involved in contemporary debates about Jewish women's general and religious education, and advocated, as he phrased it, the elevation and fostering of the religious sense of our girls and women. In the introduction to his edition, Kaufmann signals his interest in Glikl as an exemplary figure, a woman completely unprecedented, he writes. In this regard, as the historian Miriam Tulin remarks, Kaufmann understood Glikl as an ideal symbol of the Jewish woman, and as a potential role model in the present, as a writer and thinker worthy of careful study and even of emulation. Bertha Pappenheim likewise defined her translation as, quote, this intended to enliven the image of a woman, deeply rooted in her time, who stood apart with her exceptional intellectual gifts, who was faithful to her beliefs, to her family, and to herself, end quote. This outlining of Glikl as an ideal symbol or image also figured in Glikl, in Pappenheim dressing as Glikl, was embedded within understandings of her work as an autobiography or memoir, and with frequent descriptions of the recovery of a woman's voice from the past. The generic understanding of Glikl's work has had, furthermore, a direct impact on editorial and translation choices that shifted the boundaries of the text. While Kaufmann and Pappenheim do not make major textual cuts, later translators decided that the memoirs had to be forced into line, as the scholar Marcus Mosley argues, with post-Rousseauian generic categories and with the reader expectations that these categories elicit. This forcing of Glikl's work into anachronistic categories led to certain historical distortions, as Torniansky also notes, but it also eased her work's legibility and accelerated its circulation and reception by a wider audience in modernity. In this regard, Feilchenfeld's translation in particular has in recent years been harshly criticized by many scholars because of his decision, as he himself states, to make, quote, minor shifts and contractions, and to delete, quote, longer edifying narratives, which are interspersed throughout the original, end quote. He further notes that these decisions were made in consultation with the publisher in order not to interrupt the biographical presentation and to prevent the size of the book from swelling too much. These deletions and emendations were, despite Feilchenfeld's own rhetoric, not minor, and they should be subjected to critical scrutiny. At the same time, these deletions and emendations in themselves reveal much about how the generic designation of Glikl's work shaped its circulation and reception. Feilchenfeld's streamlining of the text and anachronistic forcing of it into modern understandings of autobiographical writing may undermine his translation's value in certain settings today, but his changes were well received by most reviewers at the time and arguably enabled the book's popularity among a larger readership. These deletions and emendations also proved to be highly generative and deeply informed the first translations into Hebrew and English by Alexander Rabinovitz and Marvin Lowenthal, both of whom cite Feilchenfeld's choices as justification for their own revisions. Feilchenfeld was also largely transparent about the edits he made and even included an appendix that presented a couple of the stories he cut from the text, including what has now become a somewhat infamous story that, in Glikl's account, exemplifies a parent's love for their children. It is a story about a bird with 3 chicks who lived on the seashore, to quote from Sarah Friedman's translation. This at times shocking story includes depictions of infanticide, a surprisingly prominent theme in the memoirs, as the scholar Iris Idelsen-Schein has recently pointed out, in order to bear out the differences between a parent's love for their children and a child's love for their parents. While Feilchenfeld removes the story from the main body of the text by including it in the appendix, he perhaps ironically directed attention to it, and the story was picked up by many reviewers and was soon the subject of an essay by the prominent psychoanalyst Theodor Reich, who interpreted it as an expression of distorted wish fulfillment. However, across the early editions and translations of Glickl's work, there was a remarkable commitment to preserving the concluding passage as it exists in manuscript form, a concluding passage that is difficult to square with the genre designations that had become so influential in the 20th century. The final paragraph, which bears no obvious connection to what came before, is one of the most opaque passages in the book as a whole. And the manuscript indicates that one word is illegible, lending the conclusion a fragmentary and open form that presents numerous hermeneutic difficulties for the reader. In Sarah Friedman's translation, it reads, in Nisan of 5479, a woman was standing on the bank of the Moselle at night, washing dishes. At about 10 o'clock, light shone out as clear as day. As the woman gazed heavenward, the sky was open like, and the missing word, with flashing sparks. Then the sky closed up again as though a curtain had been drawn over it. And once again, there was darkness. May God blessed be he, let this bring good. Amen. This evocative but somewhat cryptic conclusion has been variously interpreted by critics and scholars who have underlined the symbolism of lightness and darkness, but have puzzled over the identity of the woman and the passage's relation to the book as a whole. The historian Natalie Zeman Davis has posited in a parenthetical note that the flashing sparks may be Kabbalistic sparks, whereas Chava-Toniansky has recently argued that they refer to a unique astral event. What I want to highlight here is that the modern editions and translations of Glickl's work consistently preserved the incompleteness of this passage, which does not easily accord with the generic understanding of the text that dominated its early reception. Rather, despite the apparent unfaithfulness of certain translations, there was a uniform commitment to representing the incompleteness of the text, and at least to hint at its complex textual history and inheritance as manuscript edition translation. The various dots, parentheticals, and footnotes that you see here index how Glickl's work spills out of the categories in which it is fixed, underscoring what we will never know about the text and prompting the reader to pursue the meaning of this absence. Interestingly, this passage was also the first part of the book ever quoted in published form, as it opens Abraham Tenlau's feuilleton from 1864. As can be seen here, the block quotation also includes 3 dashes representing the fragmentary nature of the text, and in anticipation of Pappenheim's later rendition, which combines forms of transcription and translation, Tenlau does not translate the passage into German, but rather transcribes it into Latin letters, using a different font for Loshen Kodesh words, Hebrew and Aramaic words, and only glossing older forms of the Germanic verb to be. To conclude, Tenlau's inconspicuous article began a process of editing, translation, and reception that established Glickl as one of the most important and iconic figures in Ashkenazic cultural history, and as one of the most exceptional. Not only did she stand apart as an early modern woman and as a quasi-autobiographical writer, she became established as a representative figure of Yiddish literature and of the Jewish past, at least for readers in translation. In this talk, I have highlighted, to adopt a phrase by Emma Smith, a sociable network of interpersonal relations centered on the book. But this network, centered around Glickl's memoirs, around Glickl's writings, did not coincide with developments in modern Yiddish literature and culture. Indeed, Glickl further stands apart because she exerted no influence on the development of Yiddish literature, at least prior to the 20th century. In this regard, her work stands apart from other early modern texts, like the Zenerene or the Meisebuch, which exerted an enormous influence on Yiddish readers over many centuries. In contrast, Glikl's work became famous and influential as a result of editions and translations that were largely aimed first at a German language readership and then to Hebrew and English language readerships and to many other languages today. In 1922, the linguist and literary scholar Shlomo Birnbaum published a partial translation of Glikl's memoirs in the Orthodox newspaper Der Jud, and in the prefatory remarks to his translation indicated that he planned to publish a complete translation in book form, though to my knowledge, this book was never published. In this regard, a few years later, Max Weinreich expressed his discontent that such an important work had yet to be published in a modern Yiddish edition. It is certainly time that Yiddish publishers rectify this, he exclaimed. It wouldn't be, however, until 1967 that a complete translation into modern Yiddish would be published, in a translation by Josef Bernfeld as part of the Musterwerk series in Buenos Aires. In the Yiddish press, one reviewer bemoaned the fact that Yiddish readers were largely ignorant of Glikl, though she had become famous in German and English. In this light, the late Yiddish translation, pictured here, speaks to the fact that Glikl's work came to be shaped and understood in translation, emphatically in translation, and in context far removed from her own. By investigating her work's circulation and reception, we may encounter a number of anachronisms and errors, but we may also gain new insights into how Glikl, as both author and icon, played an often contradictory but important role in the literary and cultural history of modernity, a legacy that, as recent editions and translations demonstrate, continues to be shaped in new ways today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was excellent. And of course, we have some questions, and I assume that they'll continue to come in as you answer them. One of the questions asks how did the non-Jewish German public respond to the memoirs when they were published in the late 19th, early 20th centuries?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Feilchenfeld's translation in particular did circulate among non-Jewish readers. This is something that I think requires a bit more research, but it was reviewed in part in the non-Jewish press. It was also picked up by some non-Jewish scholars, especially those working in economic history, and became a source for especially economic history in the interwar period. I think it's fair to say that the majority of readers, that made it a bestseller, so to say, in Germany in 1913 and in the interwar period were mostly Jewish readers, German Jewish readers. But certainly some percentage of that were non-Jewish. And there is a scholarly kind of reception that took place at the same time. There's also an anti-Semitic reception that takes place, especially because Glikl writes about money lending, about trade. Some of the descriptions of her economic practice were picked up in anti-Semitic reviews and texts that kind of exploited her economic status to make claims about Jews and money. So it was definitely a fraught reception by non-Jews.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Thank you. That's quite interesting. We have a question from Barbara Sant. She asks, what contemporaries readings served as models for the manner in which Glickl wrote her story? And does anything compare? How would they have informed the reception to the publication of the book? And how would they have influenced translations? Also related, what other writings of the time give insights into some of the things, some of the events that Glickl writes about, and how do these writings compare to one another?
Yeah, to the first question about contemporaneous readings, I'm not sure if that's referring to contemporaneous to Glickl or to the translation.
I think it's contemporaneous to Glickl.
Yeah, but this is like a subject of like a lot of kind of current research is about, also kind of is about determining in some sense what Glickl read and her linguistic knowledge. This has been a kind of very active field of research. Chava Toniansky has written about this. A lot of other scholars have written about this. It's certainly the case that Glickl was reading Yiddish literature. She was reading moralistic writings, prayers, but also literary writings, adaptations of non-Jewish sources, of Hebrew sources, of biblical tales. That's, there's a lot to say about that, but just to kind of like bring it to a point, I think what is also very interesting is how that's become really kind of, even from the beginning of the memoir circulation and reception, has become a really kind of key question, is how much Hebrew did Glickl know, how much German did Glickl know, was everything filtered through Yiddish? And in the reception, a lot of this becomes blurred with modern concerns. So it becomes also about, does this demonstrate actually a kind of symbiotic relationship between Germans and Jews in the early modern period that can be a kind of model for the early 20th century? And that became, it gets like tied up. That's not necessarily like a scholarly point, but just like a point about the way in which it was received. And it's certainly influenced more recent translations. Well, I think like the most interesting is that it's also, it's probably the thing that was most effaced in the early reception and translation. It was something that was like talked about by scholars, but it didn't seem to like be of great interest to the larger readership that took up those editions and translations. And so I think a big part of like contemporary scholarship is about actually answering that question. Yeah, there are other writers of the time, Jewish and non-Jewish writers. There are also interesting kind of contemporaneous examples from the interwar period. I'm thinking especially of Hannah Arendt's edition of Rachel Varnhagen, which is also kind of recovering an earlier form of women's writing that is difficult to square with certain generic categories. So in Rachel Varnhagen's case, letter writing. And this was something that was like animating a lot of, especially feminist editing and translation projects in the interwar period, and continues to this day.
Great. Someone earlier on asked how the text is exactly an ethical will. I know you spoke a bit about genre designation, so maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, so it's certainly been understood that way, as an ethical or like a living will, or as I think I see advice on life. So Glickl's text is addressed to the manuscript, which is, again, we only have a copy made by her family, but the manuscript is addressed to her children and to her descendants. And in that regard is a kind of living will, or at least a kind of way in which to ensure that her descendants know about their family history. I think this is also something that gets interestingly picked up by Bertha Pappenheim, who is a descendant herself of Glikl. And David Kaufman was also very interested in this like genealogical aspect. So certainly one of the key features of this text, the text itself, but also of its reception and circulation, is this notion that also Kaufman and Pappenheim were perhaps actually extending the kind of passing on of this familial knowledge, albeit to readers or to family members who no longer had access to the Western Yiddish texts, but required some kind of mediation.
In regard to her family, someone asks if there are a couple of questions in regard to that. Someone asks that if there's any sense that her family, anyone in her family, may not have approved of the writing in the first place, or even perhaps this dissemination thereof. And someone else also asks if there are any known descendants of the family.
On the, about the disapproval, that's interesting. Not to my knowledge, but I could be wrong about that. But I'm not also sure how we would necessarily know that. But I think that the writing was, as Glickl describes it, motivated by the death of her first husband, and seems to have been private and then intended for the family. Later on, there are some indications that she wanted it to be actually, or hoped for other readers, though these are a bit uncertain. And I think that it's certainly something that's possible for why, I think maybe the question that interests me more, I mean, it's a very good question, but the question that maybe I am more like preoccupied with is, did certain, misogynistic views about women's writing or dismissals of women's writing actually lead to its not being published until quite late? And so, part of that's probably just accidental. There are probably many manuscripts that just families own and just never, they kind of just disappear at some point. But then, when the text begins to circulate in the 19th century, it takes a while. Eventually the Kaufman edition comes out, and then the later translations. But I think it's also an interesting question for modern Yiddish. Why did the Birnbaum translation ever appear? Was there a kind of, maybe not disapproval, but lack of interest? And this is something that Miriam Tulin talks about a bit in her book on David Kaufman. But like Kaufman's own edition was dismissed by a lot of scholars in the late 19th century as kind of like, this is just him being interested in family stuff. It's not, serious. And so there's certainly like a kind of layer to all of this that has to do with disapproval, dismissal, disinterest.
We have an interesting, if somewhat extensive question from Sonia Gollantz. She says that in reading Zora Wyman Kelman's book, Queer Expectations, that Katya Molodovsky includes Glickl in her profiles of famous women that she wrote for the foreword. And she wonders if, in these cases in which women writers engage with Glickl's legacy, if you've come across any other examples of Glickl's reception history among later women writers, and to what extent these later commentators discuss Glickl's creativity in connection with a position as a mother.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I have to wait to answer it because actually I just, from YIVO archivists, was delivered Katya Molodovsky's article about Glickl. It took a while because of shutdown and everything. So I have not read it, unfortunately, but I hope to read it this week if possible. The very fact that it exists is, of course, interesting to me. So I'll just leave that because I haven't read it, but Shmuel Charny, for instance, like the Yiddish critic, writes about, in his kind of famous text about Yiddish literature and the female reader, cites Glickl. Yiddish kind of scholars and cultural activists and writers were clearly aware of Glickl. What's not always clear to me is how they were reading it, or in what form they were reading it in. Were they reading Kaufmann's critical edition in Western Yiddish? I'm not sure if they even had access to it. Charney certainly does cite that edition. I have a kind of suspicion that a lot of them were actually reading the Feilchenfeld edition simply because it was the most widely available and could actually be purchased by a kind of common reader. And in that essay, he also is, really insists that this is, unique also because this is one of the only texts of this, caliber, let's say, this complete, this long, this complex, this interesting, written by a woman in the early modern period in Yiddish. There are other examples, but Glikl stands out in a lot of ways. And he really, like, Max Weinreich does, is promoting a modern Yiddish version to come out. And it's not clear to me why it doesn't. So it's kind of like one of the open questions for me, is why it doesn't come out. And I'm not sure if that has to do with gender. It probably does, or with also just the kind of vagaries of translation and the book market, which is also probably relevant. I'll leave it at that. It's a really rich question.
Okay, we have a question from Roni Mazel, who is a former YIVO fellow. I believe the same fellowship, or maybe not. And she writes, your conceptualization of the gender genre axis in the reception of the text is very compelling. I'm intrigued and want to know more on how you think of the workings of these elements in the early modern text itself beyond its reception history.
Yeah. Certainly this is kind of in the background. Something I'm very interested in this project as a whole is also in thinking about how early modern Yiddish texts are taken up in the 20th century in particular, in ways that also sometimes extend or mirror certain techniques and reading practices that were common among early modern Yiddish readers. So one has to do with this, famous preface in a lot of Yiddish, early, like old Yiddish literature, that this is for, women and uneducated men like women, that you have this always kind of gendered characterization of the reading audience, which is, a very kind of complicated thing. But certainly this also has to do with the early question about Glikl's own, contemporaneous models. She must have been, certainly was fully aware of the kind of characterization of Yiddish literature as feminine. And I'm sure that plays really interesting and complex ways in her writing. I don't have like a kind of succinct answer to that, but I think it's something that's very interesting and I hope to explore further. And certainly like that also then becomes repeated in a way in some of the modern text editions and translations where especially Pappenheim is interested in the gendered readership or in rethinking what that might mean in the 20th century. I think this also extends, just as a kind of aside, to the translation practices themselves. I mean, early modern Yiddish literature is full of interesting translations that radically revise and amend and cut up texts and that play with language and multiple languages. And, part of me is tempted to say, the harsh critique of the Feilchenfeld translation, for instance, or the kind of bafflement at Pappenheim's mixture of translation and transcription are also, these are things that are present in early modern Yiddish literature. And, to take early modern Yiddish literature seriously would be to say that actually, translation is editing, is cutting out the text, is adapting, is making kind of radical shifts. Okay.
Okay, we'll take one last question. It's from Peter Mones or Monis. Asks today, how does the diary inform us today? To whom? More to men, to women, to Jews, and why does this memoir still matter?
I think it's informative for everyone, but why it still matters, I think it is an important question. Like why, I mean, it's so wonderful that we have, this, like we have a new edition by Chava Torniansky in Yiddish, and in the Hebrew translation, we have a new English translation based on this by Sarah Friedman. This is a wonderful thing that is not true for most early modern Yiddish texts. Glickl's work stands out in having so many translations into German, English, other languages. And I think that has to do with the ways in which the text is exceptional. Glikl herself is an exceptional writer, as one of the only early modern women writers that we have access to. There are others, but I mean, she stands out in many ways. As a text that provides a really rich presentation of social life in the early modern period, especially the Jewish communal life, about travel, about trade, about family life, about the plague, about religious events. It's also, I mean, the style is, I think, crucial to this. I mean, it's a fascinatingly written book. And in that regard, it also matters as literature. Just something that's been like a very kind of like controversial topic in its reception. Is this literature? Is this something else? And in at least the broad sense of literature, I think I would say it matters as literature.
Okay, great. We will leave it at that. Thank you so much, Matthew, for a fascinating and informative lecture. We all look forward to the completion of your dissertation, as I'm sure you do as well. And we hope that it happens soon so we can all read it. Again, thank you to the Vladimir and Pearl Heifetz Memorial Foundation and the Vivian Levski-Hort Memorial Fellowship, which allowed you to do this work. Again, if you like what you saw and heard, please consider making a donation to YIVO. And also, please check YIVO's webpage at yivo.org for our schedule. We have lots of different programs and lectures coming up that you may enjoy. And in the meantime, let us, and it's also thanks to all of you for coming and attending. I think this was really informative. And thanks again to Matthew Johnson, and we will see you next time. Take care.